Something has changed in this generation. It's not just the world out there, it's something quieter, deeper, happening within people. A constant sense of hurry, an anxious kind of faith, a feeling of exhaustion even when nothing seems especially heavy. The Apostle Paul spoke about this with a clarity that crosses centuries, describing a kind of conflict, a kind of mind, and a kind of heart that would become increasingly common. This video is not about pointing fingers, but about recognizing signs that many people feel, yet struggle to put into words. Throughout this video, we will walk through Paul's words to understand what has truly changed, why so many people believe yet live unsettled, and how this inner landscape affects the way we think, trust, and remain steady. You will begin to see that this is not merely about behavior, but about an inner shift, a shift in values, priorities, and expectations that directly impacts peace, faith, and the way the gospel is lived day by day. Have you ever felt that something was out of place, but couldn't quite explain what it was? Have you ever felt spiritually informed, yet emotionally worn down? Have you ever wondered why living out your faith feels heavier today than it should? If these questions resonate with you, this video will help you see the time we are living in more clearly, and most importantly, what to do with it. There is a kind of weariness that does not come from a lack of faith. It appears even when a person prays, serves, learns, stays involved, and remains faithful. It is not an obvious exhaustion, nor an easily explained one. On the outside, everything still works, life stays organized, responsibilities are met, faith is still present. But inside, something begins to wear down in silence. Paul recognized this kind of conflict long before it became as common as it is today. When writing to the Romans, Paul does not describe someone far from God, nor someone indifferent to truth. He speaks as someone aware, engaged, spiritually awake, and still struggling. His words carry no cynicism or rebellion. They carry weight. He says, "For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do. This I keep on doing." Romans 7:19. This verse does not reveal a lack of desire for what is good, but the experience of a soul that can no longer carry everything on its own. What Paul exposes is not an isolated failure, but a continuous inner division. The will points in one direction, while lived experience seems to pull in another. This is exactly where many people recognize themselves today. Not because they have abandoned faith, but because they have begun to carry it as a constant obligation, something that must be sustained by force every single day without rest. This generation has learned to live in constant motion. The more active it becomes, the harder it feels to slow down inside. External movement starts to function as an automatic response to internal discomfort. Doing more, knowing more, staying involved more, all of it appears virtuous, but it does not always produce rest. In many cases, it simply fills the space where silence would expose the soul's fatigue. Paul helps us see that the problem is not faith itself, but how it is being carried. When faith stops resting in grace and begins depending on continuous effort, even what is holy starts to feel heavy. The soul enters a state of constant vigilance, where it never feels enough, never feels at peace, even without any visible failure. This kind of weariness does not come from disobedience, but from overload. It is the exhaustion of trying to align heart, mind, and life through sheer willpower. Slowly, faith stops being a place of rest and becomes a field of silent self-demand. And the more sincere the desire to please God, the heavier that demand becomes. Jesus never called people to live under this level of inner tension. He drew near precisely to those who were weary, even while they were still functioning. He did not require more effort, more control, or more spiritual performance. His presence always pointed toward the lifting of the burden, not the intensifying of it. The rest he offered was not the absence of a journey, but a different way of walking. Perhaps What is happening in this generation is not a cooling of faith nor a crisis of values. Perhaps it is a living faith being carried by exhausted hands, a sincere heart trying to sustain on its own something that was never meant to weigh this much. Recognizing this is not a sign of spiritual weakness. It is the beginning of a more honest awareness of where that weight was always meant to rest. When faith begins to feel heavy on the inside, the mind is usually the first place where it shows. Before behavior changes, before spiritual practices shift, something has already become disordered in the inner rhythm. Thoughts speed up, questions multiply. The conscience operates in a constant state of alert. Paul understood that the deepest human conflict does not begin outside, but within. He writes plainly, "The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace." Romans 8:6. Paul is not speaking only about visible moral choices. He is describing two inner rhythms. One produces life and peace. The other produces strain, tension, and restlessness. The difference between them is not the amount of faith, but the place from which the mind is operating. In this generation, the mind has learned to run ahead of the heart's ability to rest. Thinking becomes automatic, constant, almost uninterrupted. Even when one believes, the mind keeps trying to anticipate, explain, and control. Faith exists, but it can no longer slow the flow of thought. And when that happens, peace stops being a natural fruit and becomes something that must be chased. Paul helps us see that a racing mind is not a sign of spiritual depth. Often, it is simply a sign of overload. When the inner life loses the rhythm of grace, the mind takes the lead. It begins to interpret silence as absence, delay as rejection, waiting as spiritual failure. The heart wants to trust, but the mind is already several steps ahead, creating scenarios, demands, and conclusions. In this state, even good things become heavy. Prayer turns into mental effort. Reading scripture becomes a search for immediate answers. Relationship with God is filtered through thoughts that never rest. The mind tries to protect, but ends up exhausted. It tries to carry faith, but it was never designed to bear that weight alone. Jesus never asked people to master their minds before coming to him. He presented himself as rest before full understanding. The life he offered did not begin with organizing thoughts, but with trusting the heart. When that order is reversed, faith still exists, but peace becomes increasingly rare. Perhaps many are not losing their faith at all. Perhaps they are simply trying to live it from a mind that runs faster than the heart can follow. And when that happens, restlessness is not a sign of sin, but of inner misalignment. A quiet invitation for rhythm to be restored, not by force of thought, but by a presence that returns life and peace. Never has there been so much access to truth as there is now. Verses, messages, teachings, reflections, and spiritual content circulate constantly in every possible format. And yet, many people feel more exhausted than nourished, more informed than transformed. There is a quiet sense that faith has grown in volume, but lost space to breathe. Paul had already perceived that the accumulation of knowledge, when it does not find rest in the heart, can become a burden that is hard to carry. He writes with clarity and precision. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. 1 Corinthians 8:1. Paul is not rejecting the value of truth, nor criticizing spiritual learning. He is pointing to an inner imbalance. When knowledge grows faster than the soul's capacity to assimilate, something begins to fall out of order. The mind fills up, but the heart cannot keep pace. Faith gains content, but loses lightness. This generation has learned to consume truth at an accelerated speed. Much is learned, but little is inhabited. Contact with the word happens, but there is rarely time for it to find rest within us. Truth stops being a place of encounter and becomes a continuous responsibility. The more one knows, the more one feels they should be better, more resolved, more stable. And this silent expectation begins to wear the soul down. Paul helps us see that spiritual information without integration does not produce maturity, it produces tension. The mind stores correct concepts, but the heart has no space to process them slowly. Faith turns into a collection of true ideas that demand immediate response, visible evidence, measurable growth. And when that does not happen, a constant sense of owing something to God begins to form. In this environment, even truth starts to feel heavy. Each new word received seems to carry an inner accusation. You should be different by now. This should have changed already. Your faith should be stronger. Grace is quietly pushed to the background while performance moves to the center. Not by conscious choice, but because the inner rhythm could not keep up with the volume of information received. Paul reminds us that love builds up precisely because it respects time. It does not pressure, rush, or demand immediate results. Love forms from the inside out, quietly and steadily. When truth loses this environment of love, it stops healing and begins to weigh down. What was meant to sustain starts to demand. Jesus never offered truth as a burden to be carried. He presented it as a way, as life, as a presence that slowly transforms the inner world. The transformation he offers does not come from the quantity of information absorbed, but from abiding, from time spent with him, from truth that is allowed to descend from the mind and rest in the heart. Perhaps many are weary not because they know too little, but because they know too much and rest too little. Perhaps the weight they feel does not come from God's absence, but from the difficulty of allowing truth to pause, to be integrated, and to become life. When that does not happen, even what is holy can begin to produce fatigue. There comes a moment when faith stops being tested by visible difficulties and begins to be tested by time itself. Not by intense crises or obvious pain, but by quiet waiting. This generation has learned to understand, explain, and organize nearly everything spiritually, and yet it struggles deeply to remain when nothing is happening on the outside. Paul understood that waiting is not an uncomfortable gap in faith. It is part of the very process of spiritual maturity. He writes with clarity and depth, "But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience." Romans 8:25. Paul does not describe waiting as emptiness to be filled, but as a space where faith learns to breathe. For him, waiting is not spiritual delay, nor lack of response. It is a quiet form of trust, where faith is sustained even when there are no immediate signs of change. Over time, waiting began to be seen as a problem. When answers do not arrive, the feeling emerges that something must be wrong. Faith remains, but the heart grows restless. Prayer becomes not only an act of trust, but an attempt to accelerate outcomes. Understanding is sought not to rest, but to shorten the process. Patience stops being a virtue and becomes something tolerated only for a brief moment. Paul helps us see that this spiritual hurry does not come from a lack of love for God, but from discomfort with the invisible. Waiting requires a faith that does not feed on immediate results. It requires remaining when there is no evidence, no clear sign, when the heart wants to move forward but is invited to stay. This is where many grow weary, not because they have abandoned faith, but because they tried to carry waiting on their own. Jesus never treated time as an enemy of faith. He walked with people without rushing to resolve everything at once. Many transformations happened along the way, not at the starting point. His presence taught that remaining is also a form of moving forward. When faith loses this understanding, the heart clashes with the rhythm of grace and begins to wear down. Perhaps the weight many feel today does not come from unanswered questions, but from the constant attempt to control time. Faith knows how to explain, argue, and teach, but it weakens when it is simply asked to wait. And this is not a sign of spiritual weakness. It is an invitation to mature the way we trust, without hurry, without pressure, without desperation. If this reflection is speaking to you right now, stay with us and consider subscribing to the channel. Sometimes what transforms us most is not an immediate answer, but the willingness to remain present, even when everything feels quiet. Some changes do not happen suddenly, nor do they immediately draw attention. They do not cause shock or trigger alarm. They unfold slowly, almost imperceptibly, while life continues and faith remains present. The shifting of the center is rarely intentional. It begins as adaptation, as a way to survive weariness, pressure, and inner demands. Paul understood that what sustains the inner life can quietly move out of place without a person realizing it. He writes to the Philippians with restraint and clarity, "For everyone looks out for their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ." Philippians 2:21. Paul is not describing open rebellion or abandonment of faith. He is pointing to something more subtle. God is still present, still acknowledged, but no longer occupies the functional center of the inner life. Faith remains, yet it begins to be organized around personal needs, momentary emotions, and the constant attempt to keep everything under control. This shift does not come from spiritual indifference, but from overload. When the heart grows tired, it begins to protect itself. Gradually, the responsibility of sustaining faith is taken on by the self. What was once trust turns into management. The relationship with God begins to be measured by what one feels, what one perceives, what seems to work. Faith stops resting and starts being evaluated constantly. Paul helps us see that this process happens quietly. There is no visible rupture, no drastic decision. The person continues praying, serving, walking with God, but the weight moves. The soul begins to carry expectations that were never meant to be its own. Sustaining results, maintaining emotional consistency, guaranteeing spiritual stability, all of this is taken on internally without realizing the accumulating cost. When Christ ceases to be the practical center, restlessness grows, not because he has withdrawn, but because the heart has left its place of rest. Faith begins to fluctuate with inner conditions. On good days, it feels strong. On difficult days, it feels fragile. This instability does not come from God's absence, but from the human attempt to occupy a place that was never meant to be ours. Jesus never offered himself as a supplement to faith, but as its foundation. He did not enter people's lives to revolve around their experiences, but to sustain them from himself. His presence was always the point of balance, not an emotional variable. When the center shifts, even unconsciously, the inner life begins to feel the weight of that inversion. Perhaps many are weary not because they have set Christ aside, but because they tried to carry what was always meant to be sustained by him. Recognizing this shift is not accusation or correction. It is a quiet invitation, an invitation to allow the center to return to the place where faith finds rest and the heart can breathe freely again. And there is a weight that does not come from visible failures or conscious decisions against God. It forms in a quieter place, the conscience. Paul understood that, at certain moments, the conscience stops being merely a space of discernment and becomes a constant field of inner tension, not from spiritual hardness, but from excessive sensitivity, not from coldness, but from a sincere and deep desire to please God. He writes to the Romans with precision. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their thoughts accuse or even excuse them. Romans 2:15. Paul describes a conscience that is active, awake, engaged, but also one that rarely rests. A place where thoughts continually shift between accusation and defense, creating constant inner noise. When the center of faith shifts, the conscience tries to assume roles that were never meant to be its own. It begins to monitor every thought, every emotion, every silence. The desire to please God, which should lead to rest in grace, slowly turns into quiet self-demand. Even without obvious failures, a sense emerges that something still needs to be adjusted, corrected, or controlled. Paul helps us see that this weight does not come from guilt tied to conscious sin. It comes from the ongoing attempt to keep everything aligned through inner effort. The conscience begins to function as a permanent judge. It evaluates intentions, questions feelings, interprets reactions. Inner vigilance replaces spiritual rest, and the heart enters a constant state of alert. In this environment, even sincerity becomes exhausting. The more a person desires to live with integrity, the more they pressure themselves. The more they seek to please God, the more they feel they are never enough. The conscience, which was meant to point toward God, begins pointing inward, demanding emotional clarity, spiritual stability, and immediate answers. And this creates deep, quiet exhaustion. Faith remains present, but it is lived as continuous effort. The relationship with God stops being a place of rest and becomes a space of constant evaluation. Small failures gain disproportionate weight. Silences feel threatening. The soul begins to carry a responsibility it was never designed to bear. Jesus never invited anyone to live under this kind of inner surveillance. He did not call people to examine themselves without end, but to trust. His presence always brought relief to a heavy conscience, not more pressure. He did not silence the conscience by force, but gently placed it back under grace, where it finds rest and true direction. Perhaps many are living a weary faith, not because they failed too much, but because they watched themselves too closely. Not because they moved away from God, but because they tried to secure on their own a purity, consistency, and peace that can only be sustained by Him. When the conscience becomes heavy, the invitation is not to do more, but to allow grace to once again sustain what was never meant to be carried alone. There comes a moment when faith is no longer challenged by what can be seen, but deeply strained by what cannot be seen. The invisible, once a place of quiet trust, begins to feel uncertain. Paul understood that walking with God requires learning how to remain when there are no visible confirmations, when nothing seems to be moving on the outside, when faith must exist without the immediate support of evidence. He writes to the Corinthians with calm clarity, "For we walk by faith, not by sight." 2 Corinthians 5:7. Paul does not present this as an abstract or unreachable idea. He describes a way of living. To walk by faith is not to deny visible reality, but to choose not to depend on it to sustain the heart. It is to trust even when the senses do not offer enough reassurance. This generation, however, has learned to rely on constant signs, frequent confirmations, quick answers, observable change. When these do not appear, restlessness begins to grow inside. Silence is interpreted as absence. Delay feels like rejection. The invisible, which should be a place of rest, begins to produce anxiety and discomfort. Paul helps us see that this struggle does not come from a lack of faith, but from an overdependence on what can be measured, seen, and felt. When faith must be continually validated by external results, it becomes fragile in the face of waiting. The heart longs to trust, but does not know how to remain when there are no visible guarantees. And this is where many begin to wear down inwardly. The invisible requires a deeper kind of faith than one built on immediate evidence. It calls us to remain without controlling, to trust without anticipating outcomes, to rest without understanding everything. This is not easy. It is a form of maturity shaped in silence, far from quick answers and clear signs. Jesus never built people's faith solely on what could be seen. Many times, He invited trust before any manifestation appeared. His presence taught that God remains active even when nothing seems to be happening. For him, the invisible was never an empty or threatening space. It was always a place inhabited by the Father's presence. When faith loses this reference point, the heart begins to clash with silence. The absence of immediate answers creates inner noise. Prayer turns into an attempt to provoke movement. Waiting becomes constant tension, and faith, which was meant to sustain, begins to exhaust. Perhaps many are struggling not because God has withdrawn, but because they have learned to trust only when they can see. Remaining in the invisible requires a faith deeper than one that depends on signs. And that depth does not come from human effort, but from the presence of Christ, who sustains even when everything feels still. When the invisible no longer feels safe, something begins to divide within. Not suddenly or dramatically, but quietly and progressively. The heart starts living between two different rhythms. One longs to rest in grace, to trust, to remain. The other stays accelerated, trying to guarantee control, stability, and predictability. Paul understood that this kind of inner division drains more energy than any external battle. He writes to the Romans with clarity and depth, "Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey?" Romans 6:16. Paul is not speaking only about visible behavior, but about inner surrender. What the heart gives itself to determines the rhythm that begins to govern life. And when two rhythms compete within the same person, exhaustion becomes inevitable. This generation desires grace, yet has learned to live at an accelerated pace. It seeks rest, but maintains inner habits that feed urgency. The body moves at one rhythm, the mind at another, and the heart tries to keep up with both. There are moments of sincere surrender, followed by attempts to regain control. This oscillation creates constant tension, often unnoticed at first, but deeply exhausting over time. Paul helps us see that this division does not come from a lack of faith, but from inner fragmentation. The desire to trust is real, yet it is interrupted by learned patterns of urgency, comparison, and self-pressure. The heart wants to rest, but the inner rhythm will not allow it. Faith remains alive, but it is lived through continuous effort, with little room for true integration. Jesus never invited anyone to live between two rhythms. His presence always called people back to inner unity. He did not rush processes or pressure outcomes. He walked in the rhythm of grace, teaching that rest itself is a form of faithfulness. Those who came to him were not asked for more performance, but for surrender. And that surrender brought alignment between mind, heart, and life. Inner division drains energy because the heart tries to respond to two voices at the same time. One calls for quiet trust, the other demands constant control, one invites remaining. The other presses for visible results. Living this way for too long produces deep exhaustion, even when faith remains sincere and the desire to please God is genuine. Perhaps the weariness many feel today does not come from external circumstances, nor from the demands of faith itself, but from this conflict of rhythms within the heart. Recognizing this division is not spiritual failure. It is an invitation to integration, a gentle call to allow the rhythm of grace to lead everything once again. If this describes something you feel inside, stay with us and consider subscribing to the channel. Sometimes, simply naming the conflict is already the first step toward rediscovering the rhythm that restores rest to the soul. When the heart remains divided for too long, something essential begins to fade. Not faith itself, nor the sincere desire to walk with God. What is lost is simplicity, that whole and gentle way of believing where the heart knows where to look and where to rest. Little by little, faith becomes more complex than it was ever meant to be, and what once sustained begins to confuse. Paul understood that this process happens quietly, almost imperceptibly. He writes to the Corinthians with deep care, "But I am afraid that just as Eve was deceived by the serpent's cunning, your minds may somehow be led astray from your sincere and pure devotion to Christ. 2 Corinthians 11:3. Paul is not speaking of losing knowledge or abandoning truth. He is describing an inner drift. The mind fills with layers, strategies, demands, and explanations, while the heart moves away from what is essential. Simplicity is not superficiality, it is alignment. It is when the heart knows where the center is and no longer needs to divide itself among many reference points. When this simplicity is lost, faith still exists, but it becomes too complex to rest in. Every decision requires excessive analysis. Every feeling is evaluated. Every silence must be interpreted. The mind takes control, and the heart grows tired of trying to keep up. Paul helps us see that an excess of spiritual layers can create inner confusion. Faith stops being a place we can live in and becomes a system to manage. Relationship with God begins to demand constant maintenance, continuous emotional clarity, and inner performance. Simplicity becomes rare. Rest drifts farther away. And without realizing it, the heart begins to miss something it can no longer name. Jesus always led people back to what was essential. His presence did not add weight. It removed excess. He did not make faith more complex, but more accessible. Being with him did not require conceptual mastery or perfect emotional stability. It required presence, remaining, trusting. The simplicity he offered did not weaken faith. It deepened it because it returned the center to its rightful place. When this simplicity is lost, faith begins to feel too heavy for an already weary soul. Not because God has changed, but because the heart has drifted from the place where everything is ordered around him. Returning to the essential is not spiritual regression. It is protection for the mind. It is allowing faith to be sustained once again by presence, not by constant effort. Perhaps many are tired, not because they abandoned the path, but because the path became too complex for someone already exhausted. The simplicity Paul points to is not spiritual naivety. It is mature wisdom. It is the space where faith can breathe again, where the heart grows still, and where the presence of Christ returns to the center without competition. After moving through conflicts, inner tensions, and almost imperceptible shifts, Paul does not end his letters with pressure. He does not call for intensified effort or demand immediate correction. What he consistently and intentionally leaves behind is a quiet invitation, an inner repositioning, a return to the place where faith can breathe again, free from the weight of human striving. He writes with directness and deep freedom, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." 2 Corinthians 12:9. Paul does not present grace as an emergency resource, used only when everything collapses. He presents it as a foundation, as daily support, as the place where faith finds balance even while weakness remains. This invitation is not given to eliminate inner struggles or to promise emotional stability at all times. Paul does not say the struggle disappears. He reveals something deeper. The weight of the struggle no longer needs to rest on human effort. Weakness stops being a threat and becomes a place of encounter, a place where grace does not merely comfort, but sustains. Throughout his letters, Paul shows that spiritual maturity is not becoming stronger on the inside, but becoming more supported. It is not winning every inner tension, but learning not to lose oneself within it. Faith stops being a constant attempt to hold everything together and becomes real dependence, a conscious, peaceful dependence that recognizes limits without guilt. This shift is subtle, yet profound. The center is no longer the believer's ability to remain strong, but the sufficiency of grace that holds them even when they cannot. Faith matures when it stops being a test of performance and becomes a space of rest. Not a rest that ignores the journey, but a rest that redefines how the journey is walked. Jesus always presented himself as this place of support. He did not call people to overcome themselves or resolve their inner conflicts first. He called the weary, the burdened, the fragmented. His presence was never a reward for those who managed to organize themselves internally, but an invitation for those who recognized they could not carry everything alone. Perhaps what has changed in this generation is not only the pace of the world, but the kind of invitation faith needs to hear again. Not an invitation to do more, adjust more, or understand more, but to trust differently. Not to become flawless, but to allow grace to return to its place as daily, continuous, sufficient support. Paul does not conclude his vision with urgency or alarm. He concludes with sufficiency. My grace is sufficient for you. This does not weaken faith. It matures it, because when grace returns as the foundation, faith stops being a burden and becomes a path again. And the heart, even while still in process, finally finds a place where it can remain without falling apart. As you reach this point, perhaps something inside you feels a little quieter. Not because every answer has appeared, not because the weariness has suddenly disappeared, but because, little by little, it has become clearer that the weight you carry is not a sign of spiritual failure. It formed along the way while faith remained alive, while your love for God stayed sincere, while you kept moving forward, doing the best you could. Something truly has changed in this generation. But not only in the world outside, something has shifted in the inner rhythm, in how expectations, responsibilities, and even faith itself are carried. Paul was not describing a generation far from God, nor cold or indifferent hearts. He spoke of people who were aware, involved, spiritually awake, and deeply tired on the inside. People who did not stop believing, but who began carrying on their own, something that was never meant to weigh this much. When this happens, faith does not disappear. It remains, but it loses its lightness. What once sustained begins to demand. What once brought rest starts to require constant effort, and over time, the heart grows accustomed to living in a state of inner vigilance, trying to keep everything aligned, controlled, and stable, not out of rebellion, but out of emotional survival. Jesus never called anyone to live this way. He never asked for permanent emotional clarity, constant psychological control, or perfect stability. He never required you to resolve everything inside before coming to him. The invitation has always been simpler and deeper. Come, bring what is heavy, remain with me. The hand of Christ is not extended to measure performance, but to support what you can no longer hold on your own. Perhaps today you are able to recognize something important. Not that your faith is small, not that you have failed, but that the center may have shifted little by little, that the rhythm may have sped up without you noticing, that grace at some point stopped being the foundation and became only occasional relief. And seeing this is not spiritual defeat. It is maturity, it is clarity, it is the beginning of a more honest repositioning. Allow these questions to stay with you without rushing to answer them. Where have you been carrying the weight of your faith? And perhaps an even simpler one. What if trusting is not about doing more, understanding more, or demanding more of yourself, but about resting in a different way? Mature faith is not the kind that removes every tension, but the kind that learns where to place them. It is not the faith that never grows tired, but the faith that discovers it does not have to carry everything alone. When grace returns as the foundation, the journey does not become perfect, but it becomes possible, breathable, and livable. If this message has found you somewhere along the way, consider subscribing to the channel and continuing with us. Here, the invitation is not to run faster or take on new weights, but to rediscover the rhythm of grace. May the presence of Jesus accompany you beyond this video. moving gently through tired thoughts, sustaining your heart, and reminding you day after day that you were never meant to carry alone what has always been grace.